In selecting a keynote speaker for today's budget summit, our goal was to bring in an expert who could lay out what is happening with the federal budget with clarity, sophistication, and insight. We weren't looking for someone who provides a liberal perspective on the nation's fiscal outlook or a conservative perspective, but rather someone who provides an honest perspective informed by rigorous analysis and a subtle understanding of the political situation. Our search soon led us to the Bipartisan Policy Center and its Senior Vice President, G. William Hoagland. The Bipartisan Policy Center was founded in 2007 by former Senate Majority Leaders Howard Baker, Tom Daschle, Bob Dole, and George Mitchell. Not coincidentally, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. As the only Washington, D.C.-based think tank that actively promotes bipartisanship, BPC works to drive principled solutions through rigorous analysis, reasoned negotiation, and respectful dialogue. In addition to budget and tax policy, their work is currently focused on health, energy, national and homeland security, transportation, the economy, housing, immigration, and governance. The Center also has a 501c4 affiliate, the Bipartisan Policy Center Advocacy Network, through which they engage in advocacy and strategic outreach and education to bolster the Legislative Center and support efforts that bring Republicans and Democrats together on the difficult issues facing the country. Bill Hoagland joined the Bipartisan Policy Center as Senior Vice President in 2009. Prior to joining BPC, Bill completed 33 years of federal government service, 25 spent as staff in the U.S. Senate. From January 2003 to January 2007, he served as the Director of Budget and Appropriations in the office of Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist of Tennessee. In this role, he served as a liaison to the leadership of the Senate and House of Representatives. He assisted in evaluating the fiscal impact of major legislation and helped to coordinate budget policy for the Senate leadership. From 1982 until 2003, Hoagland was a staff member of the Senate Budget Committee, serving as that committee's staff director from 1986 to 2003, reporting to Senator Pete Domenici of New Mexico, who was chairman and ranking member during this period. In 1981, Hoagland served as the administrator of the Department of Agriculture's Food and Nutrition Service and as a special assistant to the Secretary of Agriculture. Going even further back, he was one of the first employees of the then newly created Congressional Budget Office in 1975, working with its first director, Alice Rivlin. Hoagland has won numerous awards and recognition for his leadership and expertise on budget issues, including being inducted as a fellow in the National Academy of Public Administration. Hoagland is an affiliate professor of public policy at the George Mason University and a board member of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. In 1997 and 2006, National Journal listed him as one of the Washington 100 decision makers and referred to him as a bottom liner who is not a hardliner. Born in Covington, Indiana, he attended the U.S. Maritime Academy and holds a bachelor's degree from Purdue University and a master's degree from Pennsylvania State University. It's my distinct honor to welcome Bill Hoagland.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon, everyone. I always worry when somebody introduces you with all that budget background. Why is it so screwed up then? And I listened to a number of your panel discussions this morning. I thought we had problems in Washington. My gosh. This is my first visit to Oklahoma. It's been a pleasure to be here, but I've had a real honor over the many, many years of having worked in the United States Senate and in the Congress to have gotten to know a number of your leaders and your senators. In fact, it was mentioned that I'm a board member of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. I don't know how many of you know, but that was established by former Governor, former Senator Henry Bellman, who I loved and worked with, and it had not been for the fact that Senator Bellman stepped down in 1981, and when the Senate switched from becoming Democrat to Republican, it was only because of that that Senator Pete Domenici from the neighboring state of New Mexico took over that Senate chairmanship, and that started, and I came to work with the Senate budget. So in some ways, I owe it to Senator Bellman for me to go into the Senate budget. David Boren, trying to be very bipartisan about this, Senator Boren, who's a good friend, and I guess president now, Boren. Senator Don Nichols, who also was a chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. And of course, I've had the honor of working with your two current sitting senators, Tom Coburn and Jim Inhofe. I also want to shout out Dan Boren, who was a real loss to the United States House of Representatives when he stepped down as a real leader in a Democratic independent, called a bipartisan blue dog. And finally, though I do not know her, I was struck in looking at your distinguished citizens from this state, and more importantly from this city, and maybe you knew this, many of you knew this, that the current new senator from the state of Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren, is a native of Oklahoma City. I didn't realize that. And when I put Elizabeth Warren up against Tom Coburn, I think, well, what? Listen, I'll be brief here this afternoon and try to leave some time for your questions that you might have. There are three things I want to cover with you, though, quickly, and that is the current schedule. You do have a federal budget that's operating literally as we speak. I want to go over that, a little bit of the history of that, a little bit of background. Bring you current on what's happening right now, subject to the actions in the House yesterday. And finally, though there's a number of legislators and elected officials here with much trepidation, I shouldn't do this, but this is an election year, and it does have consequences as it relates to the federal budget and where we go forward. So let me go quickly on an old budget here. It's hard to make presentations without slides and the crutch of a PowerPoint. So bear with me, and I understand these are available for you if you have trouble reading them in the back of the room. First of all, let's just go real quickly as to where we are right now. Literally, as I speak, last night, yesterday afternoon, the United States House of Representatives passed a large, what we call omnibus bill that grew out of an agreement that we had back in December to set a certain level of funding. I'll get back to that in a second. Now, technically, the federal government should have shut down operations last night at midnight because we hadn't passed this funding bill for the rest of this year. However, knowing that they have to work this through, the House passed and the Senate passed yesterday, and the President signed last night, just a short, what we call a short-term continuing resolution to keep government funding until Saturday night at midnight. This gives time. The House then yesterday passed its omnibus bill. And by the way, I just noticed that it passed with a vote of 359 to 67, 3 Democrats voting against, 6-4. And just to show how difficult I can see how all the issues are in this state, your delegation in the House divided. 3 voted no, Mr. Langford, Mr. Mullen, Mr. Bridenstine, I believe, and 2 voted for it, Congressman Cole and Congressman Lucas. You really have a divided delegation here on these issues. Anyway, that bill, a large bill, keeps government funded, will likely pass the Senate either tomorrow or Saturday morning, and it'll go to the President, and we will not have another government shutdown come Saturday night. Now, one thing I want to highlight on this chart up here a little bit, for those who can read it in the back of the room, is the bottom line is that we didn't solve all the problems, and one issue we did not address was something called our statutory debt limit, the authority of the federal government to borrow. And the authority of the federal government to borrow, which I consider to be something that we've never in our whole history of beginning back to the beginning of the Republic have ever defaulted on our debt, but we have this thing called a piece of legislation. I get in trouble with my Republican friends when I say this is the stupidest law on the books from my perspective, and that is we pass the spending, we pass the revenues, you have a level of spending, you ought to honor that which you have deficits that you run up, and you have to borrow, you have to honor your creditors. So in that sense, we will hit that statutory debt limit again on February the 3rd, or February the 7th, and that's coming up rather shortly. There are procedures which this Treasury can move that forward, what we call extraordinary measures. So we're going to probably be facing another one of these terrible, overall, real shutdowns when you can't honor, when you can't borrow money, sometime toward the end of February, early March, giving new meaning to March Madness. That's coming. Now, let me just quickly then highlight a couple of things. Your federal budget, and we're simplifying it here, not to surprise anybody in this room, is relatively quite simple. It's money in, money out, you run a surplus, you run a deficit. What this chart is trying to show to you is the red line is whether you're a surplus or a deficit. I always like to point out, you see where we got to an actual surplus back there in 1997, 98, 99, and 2000 and 2001. I like to tell people that that's the last time I worked on a major budget on Capitol Hill. But if I were here in the spring of 2001, guess what? That red line that says an actual surplus, that actual surplus would have been off the map. Everybody was projecting. The incoming Bush administration, the defeated Gore administration, the Clinton-Gore administration, the Congressional Budget Office, where I began my career, the Federal Reserve, everybody was projecting that red line to go off the map. Surpluses as far as the eye could see. $6 trillion in surpluses over the next 10 years. New administration comes in and says, listen, it's hard to believe, I know it's hard to believe, but surpluses can be as damaging to an economy as deficits. So there was a movement to return some of that surplus in the form of a tax cut, the so-called Bush tax cuts, adopted on Biden, to bring that red line back down to, not into a deficit situation, but to stabilize spending with revenues. It passed, bipartisan, signed in about June of 2001. Now, true story, true story. On the morning of September the 11th, 2001, I'm sitting at my desk in the Capitol writing a speech. I look around, for young people, students I talk to, they don't remember this, but a lot of you will remember this. The Saturday Night Live, remember the lockbox? We're going to lockbox away the surplus. Well, I was writing a lockbox speech for a senator to give that afternoon. Early, I have two little TVs, one for the Senate, one for the House, so they needed to come into session, so they were on CNBC or CNN, I didn't remember which. Looked up, saw the first plane. I thought, well, that's an accident. Then the second plane. So this is not quite right. And literally, and I'm not BSing you, literally before I could put my pen down, I was told to vacate the premises because a third plane was headed toward the Capitol. I put away that speech. The lockbox speech never came out again. And in many ways, almost overnight, we went from surpluses to deficit and the path down. That's an honest examination. Obviously, we had a downturn in the fiscal meltdown, or the economic meltdown in 2008, 2009, further, but brought us down. But those tax cuts that had been adopted before September 11th, 10-year tax, they remained in effect. And guess what? They were for 10 years. And so they were expired and expanded, and that was the fiscal cliff that we went through a year or so ago when we ran up against that. We passed legislation to undo some of those tax cuts. We came back. And so you say, well, Hogan, what's the problem? The red line's coming back. But look at the long-term trend going forward. That's the issue that I want to discuss with you briefly here. Hard numbers, hard to see in the back of the room. Just let me make very clear where your federal budget deficit is today. For 2013, the fiscal year that just ended back in October and will be now 2013 that we're in right now. We will run a federal deficit. I know this is hard. It's very similar to what you're doing, just the decimal points in a different place. We're running a deficit of $680 billion. That's a real improvement over $1.1 trillion in deficit in the prior year. It's 4.2% of our GDP for the economists in the room. That's getting back to something we can live with. In fact, if we stay on the path, and indeed the legislation was adopted in the House yesterday, if it is adopted, if we stay on that path, the deficit still stays high, but it comes down to about 2.5% of GDP, something we can live with. Quite frankly, I guess I say this, and I hope, I wish I was wrong, I probably will go to see my maker and never see a balanced budget or a surplus ever again. And that bothers me. As a farm boy from Indiana, it bothers me. I think people should balance their expenditures with their revenues, just like you try to do here in Oklahoma. So that doesn't bother me as much as something else. What bothers me, and what bothers some of us who are still budgeteers about it, is not so much the annual cash flow deficit, but this thing called the public debt. The accumulation of the deficits from the beginning of the Republic to today, offset by surpluses. Today, that's about $12 trillion debt held by the public, or what we say, 75% of our economy. Historically, ladies and gentlemen, historically, we have run somewhere around 30 to 40%. After World War II, I admit that was well up there into 100% of GDP, but we owed it to ourselves. There was an old senator who gets himself in trouble a lot, I know, with his glibness, Senator Alan Simpson from Wyoming, who likes to tell the story, and maybe some of you have heard it. We have a treaty with Taiwan, and that treaty with Taiwan says that should China attack Taiwan, the United States would have to go to war with China. Overstated by Mr. Simpson, but he will say we would have to borrow from China to go to war with China. That is a little embellishment there, but it is true. 50% of our debt today is not owned by you or me. It's owned by somebody outside of the United States. Now, that direction that we're headed on is that we will remain up there into the 70% range. And that's why there's still an issue. Can we find a way to balance, increase revenues, reduce spending, and a way going forward? Quickly, let me just point out, you can impress your friends and neighbors that you can put the whole darn federal budget basically on one hand for all practical purposes. It's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, just the defense spending, which is about 12% of all spending, and just paying the interest on that cumulative debt that we've had. Where has the focus? Sounds to me like it's very similar to what's been happening. Where has been the focus on deficit reduction or controlling spending? This little area over here called domestic discretionary, 12% of the federal budget. Being a farm boy from Indiana, I always like to point out that yes, agriculture price supports is a portion of our spending. 3/10 do away with it. I don't care. Do away with Department Act. That's not your problem. Your problem is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, defense, net interest on the public debt. And as we go forward, just quickly, I'll run through this real quick just to show you. It's hard to see, I imagine, for some people over here on the side. But what we have is the green bars show you how the rate of growth in spending has come down. And it has come down, but it's coming back up into the 6% range, which is why in that area, what we call non-defense discretionary, the things that the federal government provides in terms of education, transportation, Bureau of Prisons as an example, Border Patrol, TSA, all the things that most of us think about in terms of government, what I consider science, technology, NASA, NIH, all those things which I consider to be the seed corn of the future, the things that you need to invest in to grow the economy, to create the jobs, to create the revenues, to reduce debt. That is the one area where your federal government has been putting all of its effort, and that's to reduce. The bill that's passing is one example of its $1 trillion, but that's the $1 trillion down from where it was 3 or 4 years ago. The real growth area, doesn't sound like much, is in the mandatory area. That's where we all know, healthcare. Now, healthcare costs have been coming down, but guess what? As I look around the room, on one of them, I got the cart in the mail the other day, and there's more of us coming. The pig and the python, we're coming through, 70 million of us. So even though the price of healthcare is coming down, the quantity of people needing this healthcare goes up, and we have a real dilemma coming forward, which I'm touching on a base. But if there is one chart that I put up here for the purposes of scaring more than anything else, it's this one. And what is this one? It's the interest on that cumulative debt. I'm not making these numbers up. These are the Congressional Budget Office, the numbers that we all work with, the ones that Congress works with and putting together. Yes, interest rates have been, I heard the discussion this morning, it's a good time to have bonds because prices are fine. Guess what? Yes, that interest, 14% of our federal budget is paying our interest, our annual interest payment. Yes, that's come down. But guess what? As interest rates go back to normal rates, just 5% on T-bill rates, the fastest growing component of your federal budget is not going to be Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, Defense. It's just going to be to pay the interest on the public debt. 20% annual rate of growth in interest payments between the year 2015 and 2020. That, ladies and gentlemen, should scare you. And all that is taking interest rates where we are today back to something that's normal, like about 5% on T-bill rates going forward. And just to put an emphasis to this, hard to see, I understand, is all this does is squeeze out that non-defense discretionary, the investments for the future. It squeezes it out going forward with healthcare and interest payments being the major factors there. Revenues, yes. Revenues should be a part of any solution, even at the federal level. They have come down, they're coming back. But I don't think you can solve this problem in terms of getting back to a normal, lowering that gross debt to GDP back down to something normal requires that there be reductions. And let's be honest about it, ladies and gentlemen, it's going to have to be in that area which I've talked about, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Not for current retirees, but to adjust those programs for the future going forward. Near-term challenges, real quickly. Let me point out to you that, just as a kind of a budgeteer chart for you, what Congress, what our members in the House of Representatives voted on last night was to spend 1.012, the outcome. Had we not agreed to that, we would have been at what we call the sequester level of 967. So they added $45 billion back, and 22 of it in defense and 23 of it in non-defense. Now, that's an improvement? Yes, it's not, but it's not the sequester. I'll get myself in real trouble with what I'm about to say. For those congressmen who voted no on this, did they want us to go back to the sequester level and to a lower, I'll stop. And then, but most importantly, that agreement reached in December set the level for 2015 also, the fiscal year that begins this coming October. And what that means is that they have the number they need to get to work. So, you know how you begin every new year with the list, what's in and what's out. I've decided that on the what's out list is fix the debt, and what's on the in list is fix the Congress. We're not going to see much done on the way of deficit spending this year for reasons I'll get to in a second as it relates to politics. We will deal with this debt limit coming up, but we are not really going to have, because they have the number for 2015, Congress can proceed with their appropriations and move forward without any further anxiety going forward for 2015. I just mentioned this, the real problems coming are as baby boomers and how we are going to drive this, as well as the cost. This is a complicated chart, so I'll skip over it quickly, but the bottom line is that the health care costs, while they have come down, are still a major driver. And finding a solution. I've been working in health care with former bosses, Senator Frist, Senator Domenici, Senator Daschle. I need not tell the healthcare people that this is the hardest public policy issue I've ever had to deal with in terms of how to work on healthcare and to protect our needy citizens out there. Guess what? I heard this a little bit this morning in your discussions. You have the same issue that we have at the federal level. We have well over $1 trillion in tax credits, deductions, exclusions in the federal budget. Yes, I think we should reform the tax code, that federal tax code. I don't personally, it's not going to happen this year. If you did not know, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Mr. Max Baucus, has been nominated to become the ambassador to China. He will be leaving in February. Senator Wyden from Oregon will take over. That's going to complicate doing anything on tax reform in an election year. But I do think we need to do tax reform, but I don't think it's going to happen this year. But the reason I put this chart up is to point out the largest tax expenditure, if you like, that which is a kind of a play on words, is not home mortgage deduction, it's not charitable deductions, it is the exclusion on the employer-provided health insurance. That is well over with the payroll tax. That is really the major area. So once again, tax reform and health care reform are inextricably linked as we look about public policy going forward. I'll just point out here that Mr. Elmendorf, the federal budget deficit has fallen faster than we expected. However, relative size county, once again, the bottom line is it is debt. It is debt that concerns us, and how do we adjust this debt going forward is in dealing with it. I just want to point out, I did a little bit of a calculation. To keep the ratio at 70%, remember the number I told you about debt to GDP at 70%, for the next 25 years would require a permanent combination of cuts in spending or increases in revenues equivalent to $145 billion a year. So it can't all be done on the spending side. It can't all be done on the revenue side. It has to be some combination of the two going forward. With trepidation, and with a couple of minutes left, let me go here. When you have uncertainty at your federal level, the economists would tell you it creates uncertainty in the market, it creates uncertainty in terms of employment for businesses, for individuals, for states in terms of your management. And what you see here is issues like debt ceiling dispute that we had last October spikes. What you see is when your federal government's not functioning appropriately and in a way that would give some confidence to the American public and to the economy at large, you get this uncertainty. And that uncertainty since 2007 has exploded going forward. When Republicans and the senator from Texas went to the floor and said we're going to shut down Obamacare. And look, he shot Republicans in the foot, or in the head, I don't know which way. And yet, what happened then when the rollout of the Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, as I'd rather call it, the failures of that brought it back so that basically we have a tie going into the American public's view to throw all the votes out on both the Republican and the Democratic side. And when you ask the American public, I'm not a big pollster, but one of the polls that I pull out that I like, when you ask them what is the most important issue facing the country today, and this is back in the fall, so it may have changed, it's not taxes, it's not the economy, it's not jobs, it's not health care, it is the inability of Washington to solve problems. It is the inability of Washington to solve problems. That's the issue going forward as we leave. And part of this then comes down to this little. I've been at this probably longer than I should, and should call it quits, but I love public policies. But I can go back, 1982 easily. The National Journal does a survey, this was about a year ago now, about about the voting patterns in the House of Representatives, and they call it the House divided. And it's hard to see, I'm sure, but what those of you can see, there's a major overlap in 82, 97 between conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. There was a center out there, a middle that worked together to solve problems. That narrowed in 1997. For all practical purposes, 2012, there is no center left in the House of Representatives. Now, you say, well, it's all due to gerrymandering and all that. Well, that doesn't explain this. The United States Senate has also, the political scientists that I trust, have also found a high degree of polarization in the United States Senate. So it's a combination, lots of factors. I'm not, the political scientists in the room can analyze this until the cows come home. I don't know. I have my thoughts, I'm sure you have your thoughts as to what has created this. But this political polarization makes it extremely difficult to come to any kind of agreement on budgets, deficits, debt, and the future of this country, when you have also a divided Senate, a Senate under one control and a House under another control. So, just to make sure you realize, we have this coming up. We have a House right now that has a margin of 33. Most pundits believe that the House will remain Republican this fall. By the way, I didn't update this, but the number of retiring, it's hard to read. There's been a real rash of retirements in the last 48 hours in the House of Representatives. We're up to nearly 16 House Democrats that have announced, and a lot of them are people who have been around for some time. I'm sorry to see them go. In the Senate, we have a margin of 6, essentially 55 Democrats, plus 55 Democrats and independents, and 45 Republicans. So it would take a switch of 6 this fall to have Republicans take back control. No surprise, not going to surprise anybody, the politicians in the room, Republicans think they're going to take back the Senate. If they're going to take back the Senate, why should they cooperate on doing anything over the next year and let health care roll out with the issues it has? And so that Republicans will take back control. One difference here, of course, is that Mr. Obama remains president for the next 2 years. So what does that portend for the future working relationship between a Congress and a base? Not to spend a lot of time in it, the United States Senate, when I look at it, you have an election going on here, Mr. Inhofe. It is possible, I would not want to bet our farm back in Indiana on the Republicans taking back control, but the important point is there's going to be a narrowing. There's going to be a further narrowing of that margin with Republicans and Democrats. You got a gubernatorial race. I'm amazed. We've got, what, 36 governor races this year. And a large number of those are I guess, as pundits today would say, your governor is going to win re-election. I don't know. But at least that would suggest that we're going to continue to have a division out there particularly. And I would say, by the way, my sense is that where the real action over the next 4 or 5 years is not in Washington. It's out here in the States. This is the laboratory where we talk about growth and investment and things. This is where real policy is going to be determined, not so much back in Washington over the next few years. And then we have your state legislature. And I look at this and I can think to myself, boy, this is a lot of red on this chart. But it looks to me like we're going to continue to have a real division between a federal government and a state governments out there, given the makeup of the politics. So let me just close quickly here, I hope. It could be worse. As a young Senate staffer, I was always shown a desk early on the floor of the United States Senate. And this desk has got hash marks on it all over it. And it reflects this of what took place in about 1856. Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina viciously attacked, caned Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts on the Senate floor. need not tell you what the issue would have been in 1856. That attack has been considered by historians as symbolic of the breakdown of reasoned discourse. And that led to the Civil War. I do not believe we are at that stage. We have had a breakdown in civil discourse, but I remain optimistic that the issues that I have talked about, the challenges that we face, that I still believe that the good people will come together and find a middle ground here of both, which will require both sacrifices, both on the revenue side and on the spending side at the federal level. In those immortal words that you've always heard, Winston Churchill's, you can always count on the Americans to do the right things after they tried everything else. I think we will be there too. Thank you very much.